Good afternoon, or good morning wherever you are. Welcome to the second technical workshop of the Managing Digitization Projects module, which will cover how to build a digitization project. This workshop will cover: how do you plan a successful project? How do you identify priorities? What should you include? What are your short-term and long-term goals and considerations? This workshop is provided to you by the Digital Empowerment Project, a nationwide initiative organized by the 6 U.S. regional museum associations dedicated to providing free, self-paced training resources for small museums. This inaugural series of online trainings focusing on digital media and technology topics is made possible by funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. My name is Avery, and I am your host for today's program. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white, fair-skinned female with brown wavy hair wearing a blue and white striped shirt today, and I've decided to forego the glasses. I'm located in my home office, and behind me is a white wall with 2 windows. A small bookcase also sits behind me, which houses museum-related texts and various knickknacks that change throughout the year. This technical workshop will address the why and who of collections digitization projects, and in this era of virtual meetings, when digital spaces may substitute for our physical sense of place, it is important to reflect on the land we each occupy and honor the Indigenous people who have called it home. I'm speaking to you today from my home office, which is located in Erie, Pennsylvania, the historic and ancestral homelands of the Erie people, which later became part of the Seneca and the Greater Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Wherever each of us are located, let us acknowledge all Indigenous nations as living communities, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. We, the Digital Empowerment Project, recognize that our organizations, and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society which perpetuated the exclusions and erasures of many Native peoples throughout the United States and beyond. We ask you to reflect on the place where you reside and work, and to respect the diversity of cultures and experiences that form the richness of our world and our profession. Before we begin today's presentation, a few housekeeping notes. I'd like to acknowledge today's American Sign Language, or ASL interpreter, who will be situated on the left side of your screen during the presentation. Captioning for today's program is embedded in a box just below the video player on our website with controls to adjust your experience. And the best way to continuously refine our craft is to listen to our attendees. So we ask that you share your candid feedback with us. Following today's program, you will be sent a link to a satisfaction survey. Sharing your experience through this survey will only take a few minutes and will greatly improve our work. During today's program, we will address as many of your questions as time allows. However, sometimes we are unable to answer all of those questions, as others may arise when reflecting on the program. Because of this, we have set up an online community forum for raising questions, posting answers, and connecting with your fellow museum practitioners. If you're looking for help in between programs, please visit our website, the Museum Learning Hub, and click Join on the upper right-hand corner to create an account and to post your questions. A member of the community or one of our student technology fellows will respond to you. Lastly, be sure to follow us on social media to stay in touch and to be notified of future programs. Links to our social media channels will be posted in the chat area. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Lindsey Richardson, owner at Museum Person. Lindsey has more than 20 years of experience working with museum collections in all kinds of museum settings, including history, art, university, municipal, historic house, and children's museums. She has planned and implemented major collections projects, including and involving digitization, cataloging, moving to other locations, deaccessions, inventory and rehousing, as well as written grants to fund those projects. Lindsey also consults with museums about strategic planning, collections, and digital collections assessments, grant writing, and interpretive projects, such as exhibits or object-based programs. She has anthropology degrees from Harvard and Oxford and has worked with museums on 3 continents. To learn more about her, please visit her website, museumperson.com. And now please join me in welcoming today's presenter, Lindsey Richardson, and let's begin. Lindsey.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I want to thank the Museum Learning Hub and IMLS for the opportunity to talk with you guys about digitizing collections. I'm going to jump over to my slides right now. So you will still see me, but I won't still see me. So here we go. That's me. And before we jump in, I wanted to tell you that for 12 years prior to my current role as a consultant, I worked as a curator of collections at the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas. And for those of you that don't know, that is the historic site of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. So the collections were varied. They had a lot of different formats, and we digitized tons of them while I was there. They were also digitizing before I got there, and that meant that there were lots and lots of digital objects in the collections to be working with, creating, recreating. So if you want to see any samples from that time, the museum's website is jfk.org. And if you go to their collections page and poke around, there's a lot of different things to see. And I hope if you have any questions, please feel free to ask during the Q&A, or you can contact me or in the forum. Okay, so here we go, how to plan a digitization project. I found this picture on the Library of Congress website, and it made me laugh, in part because to me, it is a perfect embodiment of how sometimes when you're behind the scenes at a museum and things are a little weird and you're looking around and you're thinking, it's kind of surreal in here. There's like a special flavor of crazy sometimes behind the scenes at a museum. And this just seemed like such a perfect representation of that. And I dropped a little "You Are Here" flag in case you just wanted to remember that feeling. But I do assure you, I have every confidence that this man created a beautiful diorama, which was used for decades. And I have every confidence that you can plan a digitization project and that you will also create order out of chaos. There are a couple of starting points I want to make before I go to the next jumping in slide. First of all, I am starting from the point of view that you know what you're digitizing, why you're digitizing, and who it's for. That is stuff that Dr. Jones addressed in her presentation last week. If you don't know, that's fine. Just put a pin in it. We can come back to it. You can ask questions about that process, making those kinds of decisions in the Q&A or other formats. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm starting from the idea that you know what you're going to digitize and you just need help figuring out the logistics. Two other things. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but most of you will recognize this home truth, which is digitization does not end with the creation of digital objects. That is more or less the starting point, because you have to do so much work to ingest digital objects into a preservation environment, into an environment where you can make them safely accessible to your audience in all different platforms and formats. There's a lot of work that goes into that. So a digitization project doesn't start and end with the creation of digital objects. It starts and then keeps going for quite a ways. So we're going to talk about all those other things that you also have to do. And this is the first time I'm going to say this, but you're going to hear it many, many times in the rest of this presentation. You need to write down your plan. Write down even your rough drafts, write down your notes. It does not have to be pretty, but it is actually very important for you to write this down, not just for you and not just for the people who come after you as staff at your institution. It is a really good way to document a moment in the institution's history where things stand. But it's also a good way for you to be able to communicate with other people in your institution and beyond about the process of digitization. Sometimes digitization projects include a bit of education outside your department. So writing things down can help you be prepared for those moments. Okay, so let's get started. If we were in a lecture hall together, I would start by asking you questions. I would say things like, has anyone here ever digitized an object? And some of you might raise your hand. I would say, have any of you here ever used your phone to take a picture of an object or something? And maybe even more of you would raise your hands. I'd ask if any of you have planned a digitization project before. And I'd ask if any of you have maybe folded digitization into another kind of project like cataloging or rehousing. Have you done those things together? Because often they are interlaced. I would be doing that in part to start this presentation by talking to you about how important it is to collect data. And asking you to raise your hands would be a great way for me to collect data about you. And that is a demonstration of the kind of data collecting that you need to do to start this process. Okay, to get us started off, I got us an inspirational quote. This is J.R.R. Tolkien. He says, "It does not do to leave a live dragon out of your calculations if you live near one." This is so true. I don't know how many of you have been behind the scenes working on your project. Everything is tootling along. It's just great. And then out of the blue, there's a dragon. He lays waste to a whole countryside with his fiery breath. And the next thing you know, you got to start over because you didn't know that guy was there. So that's why we collect data, so we can map where the dragons are, and we can hopefully prevent that sort of upset. So let's jump in. The first kind of data you need to collect, and again, write all this down. The first kind of data you need to collect is physical data. You've sat around tables, you've talked about it with your curators, you've all identified you're going to work on this set of items to be digitized. Now you need to go visit that set of items in storage. You need to have a look at them from the point of view of someone who's going to digitize those objects. So even if you have seen them, if you have physically laid eyes on these objects in the past year or two or several months or even last week, you probably didn't look at it from the point of view of someone who's going to digitize each item in the collection. So now you need to go visit, spend some time with this collection. The two main kinds of data you want to collect at this point, you want an accurate count of each media format. So if you have a photographic collection, you want to know how many negative strips you have and how many images are on those negative strips. Are they all 35 millimeter, or do you have some that are 120 millimeter or 5x4? You need to think about what your different settings and procedures will be for different kinds of media format within your collection items to be digitized. You also need to check them for any weird problems. This is another dragon flushing technique. You need to know if any of those negatives have begun to deteriorate at different rates, so that some of the image layer is pulling away from some of the base layer, and you get that crinkly window pane kind of effect. That's going to get in your way. It may be very difficult to digitize those materials, certainly without treatment or outside expertise. It may only affect 3 images, but they may be really important images in the collection. You need to know because you have physically gone through and looked at everything. One of the other things you can find in a situation like that is that something is wrong with, like, the storage situation. The collection, as far as you know, has been in folders in a box. Everything is fine. You pull it out and you realize that the enclosures that they are in are still the original envelopes from ages ago. So now you know that you have to build into the process of handling this collection, perhaps also the process of rehousing this collection. And that's important information to know, that you're collecting from the physical investigation of the collection, because that's going to affect how you build your timeline. So next, you need to think about metadata. If this project is entirely your own, it is just something you're doing with your collections for your website and your audience, then you get to determine how the metadata is going to work out. You identify the fields in your database. You identify the formats that you want them to be in. This is how we do dates. This is how we do dates we don't really know what they are. This is how we do credit lines. This is how I want my description field formatted, headline, left, right, up and down, whatever it is you do. You determine which fields are to be populated for every item. It needs to be consistent across the whole digitization project. This is also the time, however, to think about if you're going to be working with partners. If you are going to collaborate, find out what their metadata requirements will be. If you're going to share with an aggregate site, like the Digital Public Library of America or the Portal to Texas History was one that the Sixth Floor Museum shared with. One of those sites that tends to be kind of statewide or region-wide or culture-wide, where you can share some things from your collection to reach a broader audience. All of that takes is that your database is able to speak to their database. And usually that's done by way of like an Excel spreadsheet or some other kind of file. But what you have to know in advance is what fields they expect from you and how they format their dates. And if they require some kind of metadata that you wouldn't normally populate for every item in your collection because it's not important to you as an institution, but it is important to them as an aggregate site. So you need to know in advance and build that in, because it is much easier to build that into your original timeline than it is to go back after the fact and try to squeeze it in and still meet the original deadline. Okay, so this is the part where people are like, oh, you are kidding me. But I'm serious. You have to collect timed data. And what that means is, by this point, you've looked at the physical objects, you've figured out what you want done in your database. You've probably figured out some of the storage implications, where things are going to be stored, how they need to be attached to your database, all of that sort of stuff. You need to begin to sketch out a preliminary outline of your procedures. Like how are you or your staff, interns, volunteers, how are you actually going to get this done for each object? Once you have that sketched out, time yourself doing it. Start the timer, go to storage, get the objects, scan or photograph them, create the files, name the files, store the files, copy the files, attach them to the database, fill in every metadata field, put them in their new housing or old housing, put them back on the shelf, end timer. You do that several times, in part because it will help you refine your procedures. You need to know if your procedures are the right ones. Maybe you have too many data fields for this particular deadline, or maybe not enough. Maybe you haven't got enough figured out there. Or maybe you're like, oh, I didn't put in enough time or attention to the rehousing. I really do think we're going to have to rehouse. Build that in. Do this enough times that you can average out how long it takes you to go through the steps you're expecting your staff to do, or other people in your department, or just yourself. What you want to do is be able to answer the question, on this project, how many items can we digitize per hour? And in this case, that verb digitize is not just create the digital object, it is also ingest the digital object. So from start to finish, shelf to digital and back to shelf, what time rate per hour can you come up with? So if you come up with 10 per hour, after you've done it several times and you've averaged all together, first you did 5 and then you did 15 and now you're at 10. When you have 10 items per hour as your rate, you can extrapolate how long it's going to take you. It's going to take you 200 hours to get this entire collection done. However, I will say, either at this point or a little bit later, you need to pad that number with a contingency of at least 25%. So if you said 200 hours, then bump it up to 250. Or take the rate down. Say, okay, average I was able to do 10 per hour, take that down to 7.5. Just give yourself a little padding, because again, with dragons, you just never know. Okay, so all of this is data that you collect because it's in your purview as a collections person planning this kind of project. Now we're going to step out one more ring. You're still collecting, you're collating data for big conversations. This is important. But now you're going to talk to some other people. So just as a reminder, I always put why up top there, just so you know your North Star. What is the mission statement for this project? Why are you doing it? Who's it for? Other things you're going to need to figure out, and you may need to talk to other people in other departments to get this information all in one place. Who owns the copyright to this stuff? Is it you? Is it public domain? You need to figure that out, because that has a direct effect on how you can use these items. Who are your internal users? It's usually marketing, education, exhibits, webmaster. There may be some others, but you need to know who they are and how they expect to get this stuff and use it. Again, this interacts with the copyright question. If some people are planning on using them in a certain way, and the way your copyright agreement worked out, that might not be possible, you need to educate them about their expectations and what is legally responsible there. External users, same thing. How are you providing access to this stuff? What are they going to do with it? Where are you going to store this stuff? If you're digitizing thousands of items and you're going to a pretty high resolution, say for images, or lots and lots of hours of audio visual recordings, those files are going to be gigantic. And most of us don't have just, rooms full of extra servers lying around. So you're going to need to talk to IT. Where are we going to store this stuff? You also need to have a conversation about bandwidth. If you're moving gigantic video files around, I know from experience that if you don't have enough bandwidth, as soon as you start to move that in your collections offices, you can slow down every computer in the museum, including the ones in retail. So you might want to have a conversation about bandwidth if you're planning on creating and moving around really big files. And also digital standards, of course. A lot of this will be stuff you want to talk about with your IT people or with your colleagues or your partners, but what formats are you using for different kinds of files? What naming conventions? What resolution for images? All that sort of stuff. Again, this is all stuff that you should write down in one central place. So now you're ready to take this data to a higher level. And this is where it's good to have this data because you can use it to educate people around you about the process and about all of the different obligations and responsibilities that may be involved. This is where sometimes you have to have the conversation where you've got to know, what is it the museum values most? Is there a deadline that cannot be moved? Then that is the deciding factor on how you get from here to there. Is it that it needs to be cheap? Now, this is actually kind of a little tricky thing to manage because, as Dr. Jones pointed out last week when she gave us that handy tool, the digitization calculator, cheap is not always what you think. Oftentimes what it means is they don't have cash for an initial outlay. So if it's going to cost $10,000 to digitize all of these items in one go and then bring them back and you're going to work on the rest of the process, then if this, especially if this has come up without being expected, then there's often not a budget item, a budget line item for that $10,000. So the initial cash outlay, that lump sum payment, is what a museum sometimes wants to avoid. They would rather feed it into ongoing expenses of existing staff. But that's where that calculator comes in. It may be worth doing the math at some point to figure out, if you count the staff hours, the supervisory and training staff hours and review of records created by them staff hours, plus all of the technological infrastructure, the servers, the backups, the firewall, the back and forth between cloud storage, the webmaster's work putting these things online and troubleshooting any issues, all of that stuff is built into the museum's existing budget, but it's being spent specifically on digital collections. And if you tease it out, you can get over time perhaps a greater expense than just what would have been a cash outlay for a vendor's assistance. So speaking of vendors, how do you decide if you're going to do it in-house or if you're going to use a vendor? There's a lot of different things to consider. Most people really stick to how much it costs and where they are going to get the money for it and what kind of deadlines they can or cannot influence. All these other things that are on here are things, of course, that would affect whether or not you use a vendor, especially the need for outside expertise. So if you have any kind of audiovisual recording, particularly on magnetic tape, you are almost certainly going to need to use an outside vendor because magnetic tapes are fragile. The machines required to take that analog recording and create it again as a digital surrogate are very specialized. And you really want someone with expertise handling your magnetic tapes because those that don't have expertise can just pop it in the machine and press play and the machine can just scrape off all the recording layer and you're just left with blank tape. So you want people who know what they're doing handling your audiovisual recordings. Almost anything that can fit on a scanner or in front of your camera, you can do yourself. You can do it. You may have to tweak and practice, but you can do it. So it's a bit of back and forth. So I put together some examples. I'll walk through some examples. We'll figure out in each case whether the museum in question might want to do this in-house or might want to use a vendor. So in this example, a local history museum receives a donation from a famous photographer, a famous local photographer. And it's a really small donation. It's 36 images. It's on 35 millimeter black and white negative strips. It's just one film strip from an old camera roll. And it's a well-known format, so it's not hinky or weird in that way. It was taken 40 years ago of one of the area's traditional celebrations. It's very high profile because the photographer is famous. But the museum does have an Epson scanner. So what do you think? It's a small number of items. So no matter what the museum decides, this is going to be a short timeline project unless there's a very high proportion of hidden dragons that no one's anticipating. This can be done with a desk-type scanner, depending on the use. If there's someone out there who wants to turn one of these images into a 5-story wrap for a building next to the museum, you're going to need help getting that kind of resolution. But otherwise, if it's going on your website, if it's going to be used, in your exhibits and programs, you're almost certainly capable of producing a very decent scan on your desktop scanner. I will say that one of the questions that immediately comes to mind is, what happened to the rights? Did the photographer retain them or donate them? Does the museum get a perpetual use license, or are they going to have to negotiate every single use of every single image from here on out? That's a series of questions that still needs to be asked and answered. But it seems likely they could handle most of this whole digitization thing in-house. All right, so example B, an art museum wants to digitize their unique collection of approximately 300 VHS tapes documenting their annual art fair and juried art prizes from the 80s to the early 2000s. Okay, so I hope that is setting off a few bells in the back of your mind, because 300 VHS tapes, that's a lot of fragile material that has a rapidly approaching expiration date. We don't necessarily know exactly what the date is, but any kind of magnetic tape recording, especially VHS, is particularly fragile and is destined to deteriorate in the near future rather than the far. So they're going to want to digitize these materials relatively quickly and carefully. So they're going to need expertise. They're going to need special equipment. They're going to need to think about the fact that 300 VHS tapes is going to produce terabytes of storage that they're going to need to be able to account for. But this is almost 100% guaranteed to be a project for them to digitize. Of course, all of that other stuff that we talk about that happens after you get things digitized still has to be done in-house. All right, last example. This is a history museum that received the photographic archive associated rights, that's good, of a small local newspaper that has since gone out of business. So it's about 5,000 images. They're almost all on 35mm negative strips, although there's also some black and white prints. This archive is already well established as a source of images for local media, schools, universities, and commercial customers. But the last time most of these images was scanned was in the early 2000s. So those JPEGs are not going to cut it anymore. The museum does have a scanner, and they also already have a backlog of requests from people who want a license agreement to use particular images in this collection. So this is exciting. Things to think about. What is the museum's ultimate goal in terms of timeline here? If they want to jumpstart on getting this all taken care of very quickly, send the 5,000 images, get them digitized, bring them back, and start processing them in the museum, the collections department, get them ingested into collections, and start answering those license agreement requests and making things available online and in other formats. But the museum is capable of doing the whole collection in-house. They have a scanner. They just have to set the settings and do the quality review, and they are going to be perfectly capable of creating usable scans of these items. It's kind of great that the museum has acquired a collection that has proven itself as an existing revenue stream that could continue to be a revenue stream for the museum. So that might actually help offset some of the costs if they decide to use a vendor. It really is going to be, this one could go either way, use a vendor or not. Either way, you're going to prioritize digitizing the ones that have already been requested and get those handled and agreed upon as quickly as possible, and then work your way through the whole collection. Okay, so you've thought through all of your particular circumstances, and what you've decided is you're going to do it. You're going to do it in-house. It's your project. Yay! I'm not going to go through every single item on this list, but I will say that, again, write down everything. Here I am telling you one more time. Please write it all down. Write down your decisions. Write down your procedures. If this project goes on for a couple of years, write a report every year. And at the end, collect a little bit more data so you can brag on yourself. This final project summary is where you talk about how many hours were spent and how many records were created and how many records were pushed online and how many visitors you've had online to those records since you did that. How many times have your educators used these things in programs? How many times have they appeared in exhibits? How many times have they been requested by outside users? How have they been used? Were there publications, maybe something like that? Has marketing used it? Put that in there. If there were any snafus, if any dragons showed up to burn a little corner to your project, put that in there too, because this needs to be documented and needs to be built on for next time. One of the nice things, I won't go into all of those advantages, but I will say one of the nice things about doing digitization in-house is that you have the analog right here, and then you create a digital image of it, and then you create the record, and then you populate the data. So the links between the analog and the digital surrogate are really strong. Those links get separated by time when you use a vendor, and you often have to pay much closer attention to make sure that your digitized item is being correctly related to its original analog equivalent. That can sometimes add a little layer of time and anxiety to vendor projects. Sometimes this can be a slow process. Sometimes other priorities can arise in the museum and push this further down, and then you have to push it back up again. And it can involve a steep learning curve, but I believe anybody with enough practice and training can do in-house digital photography and scanning on a flatbed scanner to a decent quality for use. It may take a little pushing if you need a little bit more glam, but that's just tweaking your lighting situation and figuring out how to make the most of what resources you have in-house already. Okay, so we're going to flip the script, and now we're saying you've decided to use a vendor. Yay. This is an excellent way to marshal your resources to solve a problem. If you have things you cannot digitize in-house, and these things keep getting put off because it involves using a vendor, and you finally reach the point where you get to use that vendor, yay, it is a huge relief to go ahead and get those things digitized. I will say that you do have to document your decisions and all of those things in writing, and require regular status updates from someone at the vendor's end of things. You need to answer a lot of questions in advance. They should be able to tell you anything about what's going to happen with the security of your items. You can call them up. I have done this. Call them up and say, my box arrived at your address. How are you going to ensure the physical safety of my stuff? And they should be able to walk you through their procedures. They should answer this question for a lot of people, and they should know the answers. And if they can't, you should maybe consider a different vendor. How are you going to get this stuff back? Are you going to send them a hard drive, or are you going to use an FTP site? Answer that in advance. One thing you might not know if you've never worked with a vendor is that you have a very specific amount of time. It's a very well-defined window at the end of the project in which to review the items that they've created for you. If you need to, negotiate a longer window in your contract, but when you sign the contract, before you've sent anything to them, this window has been identified. So what happens is they create all of the files for you and they send them to you, and you have that window of time, and only that window of time, to review everything and make sure it is what you wanted. I have worked on projects where I got back some images and was a little bit horrified to see that the technician had not been paying close attention. Some of my images were crooked. Some of them were off by about 15%. So there was missing visual data on either side. They were fuzzy. Like they were blurry. You couldn't focus on them, not because the original was blurry, but because the digital focus wasn't there. I've also received audio-visual files where there's been an overlay in the digital environment. And so some other clip from some other recording, completely unrelated to my original, has ended up kind of spliced into mine. So you have to review, because you don't know what you might find. If you find it in the window, you send it back and say, do it again, it's not right. If you find it outside that window, the contract is ended and you don't have much recourse in terms of getting them to address this problem. You may be able to make something happen, your director may be able to make something happen, but generally speaking, you need to work within the confines of the contract because you knew at the beginning how much of a window you would have. So that's something to keep in mind, especially for really big projects. There's a lot of advantages to using a vendor. There can be some short-term, there can be some disadvantages. Like I was mentioning before, the links between originals and files, you need to pay special attention to make sure that everything is exactly matched. Sometimes that short turnaround for quality control, but usually when you are using a vendor to jumpstart the digitization project, you're going to get high quality results and a fast turnaround because that's what you're paying for, usually. Okay, so I went pretty quickly through a ton of stuff, and I just want to make sure that we talk about the recipe because you can really boil it down. I went into some of the details, but you can boil it down. It's a pretty easy to memorize recipe for success. So first of all, you got to collect data. Ballpark figures are just not going to cut it. You really need to collect data. That's going to help you in a lot of other ways. It's really useful. The first time I did that, the first time I sat down and timed myself doing things and realized how long it took me to process an object from start to finish, I was suddenly struck by how incredibly useful that rate was to know because I could extrapolate from it. So, you know, I might have that rate, an hourly rate of how long it takes to process this kind of item in this kind of process. And it really doesn't take a lot of timed trials to then try again, but with different items and different procedures. And all of a sudden you've got a formula that you try and you know within a few items what your hourly rate is, but you have to do it enough that you're not making things up. That you're collecting significant data, not just the kind of airy number or two that we're not allowed to count on. The other thing is about this process is it helps the museum identify its priorities. Knowing what is important for this project, this reason why, this specific audience served, boiling that down and having it in place is incredibly useful. And the third point, documenting it so that everybody is on the same page is also useful. So several months or years down the line, when someone says, I thought all this was going to be done by April 2022, I thought it was going to be done. And you can say, well, we were all at that meeting and we all signed off on the fact that it was going to be done in June 2022. Here it is. You were also part of that. It's really good to have documentation, but it's also good for educating people on why it takes so long. Some people will be like, well, we'll just get it digitized. You got that stuff last week. Why isn't it all available? Having everything documented, having a sense, having procedures document so you can show someone, it's actually 75 steps from start to finish or whatever it is to get this item into a collections environment so that we can preserve it and we can provide access to it. That's immensely valuable for you and your department to be able to talk to people outside your department who may not know. It is also good to have all of these things that I've been talking about, collecting your data, the priorities that you guys are going to establish and talk about in other departments, the documentation that you can share and use in all different kinds of settings. All of this to some extent implies, and so I'm going to make it explicit here, institutional commitment. Digital collections are a little bit like that proverbial box of puppies where people are like, here, they're free. And you're like, oh, free puppies. That's awesome. I didn't pay for these. You're probably going to pay for the digitization of objects. But once you've got those objects, you're not done. That is a commitment. You have to make a storage copy. You have to make an access copy. You've got to make a copy somewhere. It could be one of those or something else that's attached to your database. And you've got to talk about it in your database in such a way that you can find it again later. And that if you need to, you can track some of those processes back to the original project so that if you need to solve a mystery, you can. Sometimes you have to solve a mystery in museums. I don't know. You're probably familiar with that. But that commitment, let's talk about that more on the next slide. So I created a slide. I want to warn you about this before I throw it up there. I created a slide for all the things I didn't have time to talk about. So don't be overwhelmed. Right, there it is. Okay, so just a little reminder, write it down, write it all down. Institutional commitment. You need to identify the decision makers who are going to be working with your digital collections. Most of us in collections do not think, I'm going to ask the IT manager to join us to talk about collections preservation for our analog collections. That seems inappropriate. That's not where their expertise is best used. But the IT person or someone from IT certainly needs to be part of your conversation about digital collections, because they're the ones who are managing a lot of the processes that affect the long-term preservation and the public access that you're hoping these objects will be able to grant. So you need people identified as decision makers, and they will probably be interdepartmental, and they need to meet semi-regularly. Eventually, you're going to want a preservation policy. You're also eventually going to want to hunt down where the line items in various departments' budgets are that are related to digital collections. You don't have to do any of that right up front just because you're doing a digital project, but the longer you are a steward of digital collections, the likelier you are to be a steward of ever more digital collections. And eventually you're going to find yourself with terabytes of storage, thousands of records and files, and you need to be able to keep track of who's accessing them, who's using them, when they're beginning to age out, all kinds of data. You're going to need help. So having a preservation policy and having a budget can help with that. Rights and reproductions, we only touched on them very briefly. I have put some materials in the supplemental materials and resources for this unit. All of that will be available when the entire module is complete. So in July, you can look back at all of the resources for this module, and you'll find some stuff that I put in there that can help you find more information about how rights and reproductions may intersect with your collections and your digital collections. I'm not going to go into technological infrastructure other than to say that Elizabeth is going to talk about some really great stuff next week. And I, for one, am looking forward to hearing what she has to say, because that to me was always the part that was changing. I feel like it changes a lot, and it kind of depends on who you're talking to. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Elizabeth has to tell us about that. Digital collections are not permanent collections, although they may be a permanent feature of preservation and access strategies for permanent collections. They're not permanent because they just don't last forever. They age out. You have to do them again. So anytime you digitize things, you are trying to do them to such a high standard and to such professional quality that you don't have to digitize them again anytime soon. Although you are doing it with the sure knowledge that at some point you are going to have to digitize everything all over again. But you're doing it so well now that hopefully it will be years and years before the people who follow in your footsteps will have to even imagine such a thing. So I hope this has helped. I've really looked forward to talking to all of you about this. I will say all of the images used were public domain unless otherwise credited. And this is how you find me. So if anything I've said struck a chord and you need to follow up with me, please look up on my website, museumperson.com, or email me, Lindsey, Lindsey, at museumperson.com. And here's all the information on how to follow the Museum Learning Hub. And that's that. I wanted to make sure I left plenty of time for Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay, for a great presentation. I think that your examples and your scenarios, I hope, were very helpful to folks, and especially in laying out whether to do these things in-house or do them with a vendor. So we do have a couple of questions from our group, so let's get started with them. You talked about your dragons at the beginning. What are the unexpected pitfalls you should take into account when building a digital project?
Yes. Okay. So some of the things that have come up when I've been working on a project in the past. Everyone agrees this is the priority. We're going to get this done. And then you're about 2 months in and the whole institution takes a left turn to pursue something else. So then you're kind of left with, okay, what do we do with this project? Oftentimes what happens with digitization is it gets built into something else. So if you're cataloging collections, digitization is often built in because capturing an image becomes part of the preservation process of processing collections for cataloging. So anything that can happen to a cataloging project can also happen to digitizing. You can have trouble with equipment. You can have high turnover with your staff, your volunteers, your interns. This is another reason to write down your training procedures and your step-by-step procedures, because if you constantly have to train new people, that slows things down. But if you sit down with them once and walk it through and then give them a document and say, now you practice, they have it there. They don't need you to hold their hands every time. I think that's probably just a couple of the things, other than the ones I talked about in the presentation. I think that's probably just a couple of things. I hope I answered that question.
I think so. I think one of our key takeaways is write everything down and document everything.
Yes, I didn't tell you the scary story I have about that, but if you want me to, I will.
We can always save that for the end if we have time. So
right. Okay.
All right. Next question we have is, how should I go about imaging fragile or oversized collections like maps and blueprints if I'm doing them in-house?
Okay, one of the ways that we approached that at a couple of the museums where I worked in the past is we used an overhead approach. So you can manage that a couple of different ways. It depends on just how oversized this item is. If it's absolutely massive, then roll it out on the floor, get on a really big ladder and stand up there with your camera and take pictures. If it's slightly less massive, you can roll it out on a floor or a table or a low platform. And you can use a tripod that extends over it. You can hold the camera out over while you're on a ladder. If it's even a little bit smaller than that, but still too big for a scanner bed, you can use an overhead document camera, which has sort of a little setup like this where the camera is facing downward. And anything you spread out below, like a double fold, like a newspaper open to both pages, that can be captured in that way. In all of those cases, you're going to have to tweak the lighting, because when it's really, really big, you've got to light evenly all the way around. So you may have to experiment a little bit with that either way.
Okay. Next question is kind of a big one, and I'm sure one that many of us have. How do you build a team that you trust with a project like this? And how do you balance your vision while still giving others creative agency?
That is an excellent question. I have found over the years working on big collections projects that one of the most successful approaches is to have a weekly team meeting and to have very specific definitions of what each person is doing on the team. So if you have a couple of people who are going to spend all of their time, 100% of their time, maybe they're grant funded positions or they're volunteers or interns, but whatever time they spend at your museum, 100% of it is being spent on this digitization project. Give them ownership of the procedures. Not that they can just run away and change it all, but that at your weekly meeting, if they raise a question and say, you know what, you have that we need to do these steps, but we're finding those repetitive with these other steps. Do you mind if we blend those together and instead do this? And you say yes, then it's their job to update the procedures document and to refine those procedures and keep you posted on how it's working. I do find that weekly meeting is essential, not only to troubleshooting, but to letting people have their own independence within the confines of a project, because it gives you a weekly opportunity to solve problems for them, to head problems off. Like if they say, we're working on this collection or this part now, but I see this coming up and I'm a little worried about blah, 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 you have a week or two in which to deal with blah, blah, blah before they get there. But also you get to celebrate their accomplishments. So if they accomplish a huge milestone, maybe they did 50% of the project, you get to celebrate at your weekly meeting. And that's tends to be really good for morale.
And that is a great reminder to continue to boost morale by talking about those achievements at those weekly meetings. That's great advice. We have 2 more questions in our pool, and I do just want to remind our viewers that if you do have questions, please put them in the chat area. Also, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, we will capture those as well. So be sure to keep asking those questions. So next question we have is, what possible ways can digitized collections be used to engage visitors? What other digital tools might be out there?
You have a lot of options. I know many museums out there have explored the possibility of developing a site-specific app, particularly historic sites or museums for which the outdoors is also a part of their site. You can develop an app. You can use your collections as the sort of points of entry. I know that the Sixth Floor Museum has done that with Dealey Plaza. Dealey Plaza is its own landmark administered by other people. It is not owned by the museum. So the museum has its material, its interpretive material on the 6th and 7th floors of that building, but it wants its visitors to be able to go out into the plaza and connect what they're seeing to the historic materials in the museum's collection. So they've been able to do that. You don't always have to be high tech though. You can certainly use collections in programs. You can use them in distance learning. You can use them in interpretive materials. Even, we at the Sixth Floor Museum used them in a touchscreen interactive at one point, but I've also been at museums where we use them on a handout that we give people so that they could, access the information about collections by paper. There's no reason to sneeze at low tech if it's effective. So it kind of depends on your goals and what you're trying to achieve, what your timeline and your budget is.
Okay, and next question is, somebody is curious about the idea of shared digitization projects. Do the rights remain with a single institution, or is it just the metadata that's shared out?
That is going to depend on the relationship between the two entities. I can speak to the experience I had at the Sixth Floor Museum. At that time, we shared material with the Portal to Texas History, which is an aggregate site, which, as it says, talks about all of Texas history, not just the Kennedy assassination. It talks about all kinds of things. The Portal to Texas History had an agreement where we could share materials with them that the museum owned the rights or that were public domain. If there were other situations, I'm not entirely sure that they could work it out because they need to be able to share them and push them out. And usually the only really safe ways to do that are because you're dealing with the rights owner or it's public domain and there is no rights owner. So you kind of have to work it out with your partner in that sense. But in most cases, I would think if there's any kind of sticky situation with the rights ownership, it may not be the right candidate to share on one of those aggregate sites.
Okay, and just in your last few slides of your presentation, you talked a little bit about the fact that digital isn't necessarily synonymous with forever. So you talked about how you're going to have to essentially do this process over again. Is there a recommended timeline for when people should consider redoing some of their digitized collections, and how do we keep people or keep teams at museums aware and always thinking about that process?
Yes. Okay, so in terms of determining if your digital objects are still good enough, you yourself can answer that to some extent. Every time you share it with an exhibit designer or with an educator, do they send it back and go, do you have something sharper? Do you have something a little better? Do they get that sort of pained look on their faces? If they do, you probably need to address the quality of what you've got. And if you don't find it good enough to work with, if you're kind of like, I can't even figure out what this problem is, because looking at this image, I'm going to have to go get the object, then maybe sometimes that's just a limitation of photography, but sometimes that might be a limitation of a not quite sharp enough image. And also, if you know it's been around 7 or 10 years, technology has probably changed. Some things are still good enough and some things aren't. But people will usually tell you if they're trying to access something and they're like, this is not good enough. They're usually not shy about that. Another way of keeping up with that is professional development. There's a lot of great training available out there. 2 really good sources are the Northeast Document Conservation Center, which is based in Boston. And every year they have almost every year, I think they have a professional development workshop that is specifically about dealing with digital collections in a lot of different formats. And you can usually learn what the latest trends are through them. You can also do online stuff through them and through Lyrasis, which is another source of information for people in the profession who are dealing with digital collections.
Those are fantastic resources to share. Thank you. And since we are at time, I want to ask you, Lindsay, if you have any final words of wisdom for us as we leave today talking about digital projects.
I think that digital projects can be overwhelming if you haven't done them before. But a lot of people who think of themselves as never having done them before have really dealt with digital objects in other contexts and just need to think it through. So one of the things I did was provided as a resource, kind of a checklist running through the process that I described today, so that if you want access to that, it will be in the supplemental resources when this module is completely available in July. But don't be intimidated by it. You can do this. You have already done parts of it without even knowing it. And I think that digitizing collections is here to stay. It's a permanent part of our preservation and access strategies. But it's one of those that's always changing because technology is always changing. So it's kind of fun to keep up with it.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for walking us through the entire process, getting started with your digitization project. So to wrap things up, thank you all for attending the second technical workshop of our Managing Digitization Projects module. And very much big thank you to Lindsey Richardson. After each module, all 4 videos will be available on our website, as well as a complete toolkit of resources provided by our presenters, as Lindsay mentioned. If you would like to receive the toolkit pre-broadcast, those are sent out to those that register through our Eventbrite page. You can access that sign-up page through museum-hub.org and go to the attend page. So sign up for next week's webinar, and the toolkit will be emailed to you ahead of time. So remember that you can always review past webinars on our website under the Learn tab and then past webinars. Last few reminders, please visit the forum on our website to continue to ask questions and engage with our community. Follow us on social media to stay aware of future programming. Links will be provided in the chat for those. And don't forget to complete the post-event satisfaction survey. As we mentioned, your feedback is very important to us, and it will take just a few minutes to complete. And join us next week for technical workshop number 3, which will cover imaging standards and logistics in digitization projects on Tuesday, June 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time. That will be, our presenter will be Elizabeth Chang from the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York. Thank you all again for joining us on the Museum Learning Hub. Have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.